At the same time, so much of the land was taken by bloody force from non-Muslims. So that's just one point. Dr. Dabashi mentioned the illegal invasion of Iraq. I agree, it is an illegal invasion. But then again, Iraq was part of Mesopotamia, it was part of the Persian Empire, and it was illegally invaded by Muhammad's followers, and it was conquered by bloodshed and annexed into the Islamic Empire. So if we really want to make a historical argument, we need to keep this in mind. A lot of times when you go to colleges and you start hearing about when do Christians and Muslims fall out, it always seems to me to be with the Crusades, as if everything before then was love and peace between Muslims and Christians. And then one day Pope Urban decided to get a bunch of wild crusaders to go and cause bloodshed in Jerusalem, which they did in 1099, and it was violent. But what you won't hear about is how Jerusalem was conquered 500 years earlier by Muslims and annexed with also a bloodbath. So in other words, let's always keep history. That's my field, that's what I study, and I always believe in keeping a historical context. As to the whole concept of Sufism and philosophy, I do not at all discount that. And I think in the Islamic civilization and the evolution of Islam throughout the Middle Ages, there were many great things, as I indicated earlier. And I think Sufism was one of those things. But again, Sufism amounts to, last time I checked, maybe a couple % of the Islamic world. And to a lot of Sunnis, a Sufi is actually a heretic that you wouldn't even consider a Muslim, because they're not living, again, according to those black and white laws that have been articulated by the schools of Islamic jurisprudence. Dr. Dabashi also mentioned consensus, ijma, which I did not mention. And so the Quran and the Hadith are the primary sources, and then the secondary sources you can say are ijma and qiyas. Now ijma, it just so happens when I was talking about jihad as an obligation on the Islamic ummah to wage it until the whole world is brought into the fold of Islam, all of the ulama, or at least the ones that ultimately count of the four schools, have ijma, have consensus on this. And so it does become an obligation on the Islamic community, just because of these men, the ulama, the scholars. There was one school, Awza'i, who was one of the first schools of thought, but he didn't necessarily believe in this, but he was subsumed eventually by the other four schools, and all four of them agreed to it. So you have the Quran being interpreted by the ulama as meaning jihad against infidelity until the world is conquered. You have the Hadith with some very straightforward comments. And now you have the ulama, and there's consensus about it. And so therein lies, to me, the ultimate threat to Western civilization, that you have a codified worldview that you, as a Muslim, if you do not uphold it, it's no less than you not upholding the other laws, such as drinking alcohol, or not drinking alcohol, or eating pork, or not doing your prayers, or doing the Hajj, because of the nature of its codification. And now, this issue of Sufism and philosophy, as much as there are good things and things that I would support, the problem that we're contending right now is Salafiyya. And Salafiyya, in many ways, a lot of people will present it as some sort of aberrant Islamic movement or Wahhabism that has hijacked Islam and made it ultra-militant, ultra-violent, this and that. Now the thing is, and then at the same time you'll get a bunch of people saying what Islam needs is a revolution, is a reformation, kind of like the Protestants. But if you really study Salafiyya, that is to me identical to the Protestant Reformation, because the Protestant Reformation was essentially Christians saying we're going to break away from church, we're going to break away from tradition, and we're going straight to the primary sources, the primary texts, which are the Bible. What the Salafiyya movement is basically Muslims saying, look, excuse me, we're done with, with philosophy, we're done with Sufism, we're going back to the straight text, the oldest thing. This is what Salafiyya means, which is the forebearers, the original generations of Muhammad and 2-3 generations after him. And when you do that, and you start studying the life of Muhammad and following the Sunnah and everything he did, literally, I'm sorry to say it, and I'm not trying to be offensive to any Muslim, but Muhammad led a very violent lifestyle, and he was a warlord, and that's the bottom line. Like I said earlier, he had women, execute. I'll give you one anecdote that is considered authentic. One woman who was about 100 years old, her name was Khirfa, who was a poet, made fun of Muhammad. Muhammad had 2 assassins go tie her legs to 2 different camels, draw them in different directions, and split her apart. Now, we can sit back and say that's not true, that's spurious, But the fact is, it's in Islam's canonical text, and a lot of Muslims will believe it, and a lot of Muslims will say, this is what our Prophet did, this is how we're also going to deal with problems. And so that's why this issue of Salafiyya, as good as Sufism is, as good as Islamic philosophy is, as good as mainstream or moderate Islam is, Salafiyya is always going to be much more doctrinally and theologically authentic than the aforementioned. And that's why when you get these jihadists doing what they're doing, it's very hard for moderate Muslims to condemn them openly, because they know that the Salafis have the stronger doctrinal base, because they always trace it to Muhammad, they always trace it to the schools of law, they also always trace it to the earliest, most pious Muslims. And so I think this is ultimately the problem that's going to lead. And at the same time, I am not in the least bit apologizing for the depredations of the West or colonialism or any of that. But this begs the question, even if the West did not do what it's done, even if Israel ceased to exist and never existed, that won't change what I've been delineating here about Islamic law and jihad. In other words, if Israel didn't exist, Jews are still going to be considered second-class citizens in Islamic law who should be fought in perpetuity until they are subjugated, just like Christians. And Buddhists and pagans should be just fought and given two options, either convert or die. So what I'm saying is, you have on the one side the West and Israel doing whatever they're doing, and you can say it's good or bad. But on the other side, you have a transcendent kind of argument that doesn't care what they do. Sure, if they do things that are aggressive to the Islamic world, that's only going to probably provoke a greater response. But even if they didn't, it's still, they are doctrinally the enemy who must be fought. And so that's why ultimately I feel that it is, in fact, it will lead to something of a clash of civilizations. Even though you won't see it now or maybe in this lifetime, why? Is it because jihad has stopped? No, it's because we're living in a day and age where jihad is not capable of doing of actually battling the non-Muslim world in an effective manner. That's all. Thank you. I'll just go around.
One, history. He has a very important point. So history, how much do you go back and how far? I have recently found myself in difficulty with especially the Iranian community for comparing Cyrus the Great, which is very important to them, to George W. Bush, and saying that Cyrus the Great liberated the Jews the way George W. Bush said is liberating the Iraqis. So if I am against imperialism and against militarism, I'm against them. It doesn't matter who does them, Muslims or Persian empires or Americans or Europeans, simple as that. So the question of history doesn't mean how far you go back. In fact, for the sake of argument, you need to contextualize. But for the sake of solution, what do? You just start from right now and right here and just stop killing each other. Genocidal violence, homicidal violence, or suicidal violence. Let's just put to the end of that. In the point of Sufism, Sufism was responsible principally for the establishment of the Safavid dynasty in Iran of the 16th century. They were Sufi order that gradually developed into a dynasty that ruled over Iran for 2.5 centuries. As for the Salafiyya, again, the problem is to connect the idea of jihad to Salafiyya. Salafiyya is part of the 18th and 19th century religious and revolutionary movements in much of the Islamic world that has come now to our time. And again, you need to contextualize it. And as I said repeatedly, contextualization doesn't explain it away. But the colonial context of the rise of Salafiyya is absolutely necessary for us to understand it. The point of Mr. Ibrahim, that even colonialism didn't exist, even if Israel doesn't exist, I'm not for the eradication of Israel, if they would have done it, is, as a historian, as you know, you can't make that point. You have to talk about what has actually happened, not as what would have happened. So far as doctrine is concerned, for every single doctrine that exists, that is violent doctrine, you have a counter doctrine. Okay, the idea of jihad, which is a military conquest, is a very famous tradition that says that the Prophet, addressing Muslims coming back from a conquest, told them, now you have come back from a lesser jihad, and it begins your bigger jihad, Jihad al-Akbar, which is against your carnal soul. Which this idea is taken by the Sufis and turned into a whole doctrine of fighting against your own carnal soul. I mean, this is something that happens to any world religion.